When the world thinks of reggae, they chant the name Bob Marley. But very few know that the true brain behind the music was Peter Tosh. His entire life was a blood-soaked war against the Babylon machine. He despised the white-owned record labels for whitewashing his legacy, reducing him to a nameless shadow. The trauma drove him to such severe paranoia that he slept every night with a loaded gun hidden under his pillow. Yet the ultimate cruelty didn't come from Western capitalists. The man who fired the bullets that shattered Peter Tosh's skull was a childhood friend from the slums, a man Tosh had brought into his own home to shelter, feed, and fund. It was a grim death sentence for a man who dared to fight the world only to die because of misplaced mercy. But a tragedy of this magnitude and the systematic erasure of a legacy doesn't happen overnight. Before the international record contracts and the global stadium tours, we must look at the raw, unforgiving environment that forged his militant spirit. He was born Winston Hubert McIntosh on October 19, 1944, in the deeply rural parish of Westmoreland, Jamaica. He was abandoned by his parents early on and raised by his aunt. His childhood was defined by severe poverty and a strict, heavily religious upbringing. But even in the rural isolation of Westmoreland, young Winston possessed an innate, almost terrifyingly natural aptitude for music. He was not afforded the luxury of formal musical training or expensive instruments. He observed a man in his village playing a guitar, watched the finger placements for half a day, and then went home to replicate it. He famously built his first crude guitar out of a discarded sardine tin, a piece of wood, and plastic fishing line. He didn't just learn to play music, he learned how to physically construct it from the garbage left behind by society. In the late 1950s, like thousands of other rural Jamaicans seeking economic survival, a teenage Winston migrated to the sprawling, hyper-violent capital city of Kingston. He landed in Trenchtown. Trenchtown in the early 1960s was not merely a neighborhood. It was a dense, suffocating pressure cooker of economic desperation and political tension. It was a labyrinth of government-built concrete yards, corrugated zinc fences, and open sewers. The youth living in these yards were fundamentally locked out of the official Jamaican economy. They were subjected to harsh police harassment and largely ignored by the post-colonial political class. But Trenchtown was also a place of immense explosive cultural collision. The sounds of American R&B and soul music drifted across the radio waves from Miami, mixing with traditional Jamaican mento and calypso. It was in this harsh, creative crucible that Winston McIntosh transformed into Peter Tosh. He grew into a towering, intimidating physical presence, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with a deep, booming baritone voice and a gaze that refused to break. He possessed a fierce, natural intellect and a deeply cynical view of authority. In the early 1960s, the geography of Trenchtown brought Tosh into contact with 2 other teenagers who were navigating the exact same poverty and musical ambition, Robert Nesta Marley and Neville O'Reilly Livingston, who would become known as Bunny Wailer. The 3 young men began harmonizing together in the local government yards, under the strict vocal tutelage of local music legend Joe Higgs. They formed a vocal group called the Wailing Wailers. The name was literal. They were voicing the wails and the cries of the ghetto. But vocal harmony alone does not build a musical revolution. The official, heavily marketed history of reggae often presents Bob Marley as the singular genius who drove the band. This is a profound historical distortion. In those early formative years, Peter Tosh was the absolute musical engine of the group. While Marley and Bunny were primarily vocalists at the time, Tosh was the only member of the core trio who could actually play instruments. His hands translated their collective anger and hope into physical rhythm. In a historical fact that Island Records would later work very hard to obscure, it was Peter Tosh who sat down in the dirt yards of Trenchtown and personally taught Bob Marley how to play the guitar. Tosh developed the signature, unyielding staccato guitar rhythm, the sharp chank or skank on the offbeat, that fundamentally defines the structural architecture of reggae music. He was the militant backbone. Marley provided the charisma and the melodic hooks. Bunny provided the ethereal high harmonies. But Tosh provided the steel. In 1964, the trio walked into Studio One, run by the legendary ruthless Jamaican producer Clement Coxsone Dodd. They recorded a ska track called Simmer Down. It was a direct, localized message to the violent street gangs, the Rude Boys of Kingston, urging them to cool their tempers. The song became an absolute runaway #1 hit in Jamaica. The Wailing Wailers were suddenly local stars. Their voices were blasting out of every sound system on the island. But local fame in the Jamaican music industry of the 1960s was a devastating illusion. The economic structure of the Kingston recording studios was inherently predatory. Producers like Cox and Dodd owned the studios, the pressing plants, and the distribution networks. They paid the artists a flat, brutally small session fee, sometimes just a few pounds, and then kept 100% of the royalties and writing credits. For Peter Tosh, this was his first direct, agonizing collision with the Babylon system. He and his brothers were generating massive, island-wide hits. Their music was packing dance halls and generating significant capital for the producers. Yet Tosh, Marley, and Bunny were still sleeping on concrete floors. They were still struggling to buy food. They were famous, but they were entirely destitute. This blatant economic exploitation deeply radicalized Tosh. He refused to adopt the compliant, grateful attitude expected of young ghetto musicians. He became notoriously difficult for the producers to manage. He demanded fair compensation. He demanded proper writing credits, and he refused to bite his tongue when he was being robbed. He began to view the music industry not as an avenue for creative expression, but as a direct continuation of the colonial plantation system. The white plantation owners had simply been replaced by the studio producers, and the sugar cane had been replaced by vinyl records. To survive the psychological weight of this poverty and exploitation, Tosh fully embraced the Rastafari faith. For him, Rastafari was not a passive, peaceful religion of meditation. It was a militant, anti-colonial philosophy of black liberation. He grew his dreadlocks, adhering strictly to the Ital diet, and openly embraced the sacramental smoking of marijuana, which he aggressively defended as a spiritual right. He adopted the persona of the stepping razor, a man who was sharp, dangerous to cross, and fiercely protective of his own dignity. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the fast, upbeat tempo of ska slowed down into the heavier, more deliberate bass-driven groove of rocksteady, and eventually settled into the gritty, rebellious pulse of early reggae. The Wailers having left Coxsone Dodd and briefly worked with the erratic genius Lee Scratch Perry, had matured into a formidable, completely unified musical force. They had formed their own independent label, Tough Gong, in a desperate attempt to control their own finances. They were a brotherhood forged in the absolute fires of the Kingston slums. They had survived starvation, street violence, and the ruthless theft of their own intellectual property by sticking together. By 1971, they were arguably the tightest, most authentic, and most powerful band in the Caribbean. But despite their localized power, they were entirely financially exhausted. They were stranded in an economic dead end, possessing a revolutionary new sound, but lacking the capital or the international distribution network to survive. Desperate for a breakthrough, they were about to look outward beyond the shores of Jamaica. They were about to step directly into the crosshairs of a massive white-owned Western corporate machine. It was a machine that recognized their genius, but was absolutely terrified of Peter Tosh's militant identity. The brotherhood that had survived the slums of Trenchtown was entirely unprepared for the calculated multi-million-dollar strategy that was about to systematically tear them apart. The winter of 1971 in London was a brutal, unforgiving environment for three young men born in the tropical heat of the Caribbean. The Wailers had traveled to the United Kingdom as a backing group for the American singer Johnny Nash. They had arrived with the promise of international exposure, but the reality of the music business quickly violently asserted itself. The tour collapsed, the funding evaporated, and the promoters abandoned them. Peter Tosh, Bob Marley, and Bunny Wailer found themselves stranded thousands of miles from Trenchtown, shivering in cheap, unheated boarding houses, unable to afford the airfare back to Jamaica. They were the undisputed kings of the Kingston Underground, but in the freezing streets of London, they were entirely destitute. It was in this state of absolute financial desperation that they walked into the offices of Island Records and sat down across from a man who would fundamentally alter the trajectory of their lives and permanently destroy their brotherhood. His name was Chris Blackwell. Blackwell was not a standard British record executive. He was a white Jamaican, born into a wealthy family whose fortunes were deeply tied to the island's colonial history. He possessed a sharp, calculating business mind and a deep, authentic understanding of Jamaican culture. He had built Island Records by exporting ska and rocksteady to the Caribbean diaspora in the UK, but he was hungry for a massive global crossover act. When the Wailers walked into his office, Blackwell did not just see a desperate reggae band. He saw a raw, unrefined commodity with explosive international potential. In a move that shocked his own staff, Blackwell gave the band an advance of £4,000, a staggering sum at the time, and told them to return to Jamaica to record an album. It was an incredible act of financial trust, but it was not an act of charity. Blackwell was purchasing their absolute loyalty, and more importantly, he was purchasing the right to mold their identity. The Wailers returned to Kingston, rejuvenated by the massive influx of capital. They poured their blood, their fury, and their intricate musical mastery into the recording sessions for what would become the landmark album Catch a Fire. Peter Tosh laid down fierce, uncompromising rhythm guitar tracks, his hands driving the militant pulse of the record. He contributed his own songwriting, infusing the sessions with his signature, unyielding demands for justice and black liberation. When they handed the master tapes over to Island Records, they believed they were delivering the pure, undiluted sound of the Jamaican ghetto to the world. But Chris Blackwell had a completely different agenda. When Blackwell received the raw tapes in London, he made a cold-blooded, purely economic calculation. He looked at the cultural landscape of the 1970s. The lucrative Western music market was dominated by white, middle-class college students listening to rock bands like the Rolling Stones and Pink Floyd. Blackwell understood that the raw, heavy, unpolished sound of Kingston reggae, combined with the militant, uncompromising black power ideology of Peter Tosh, would terrify this demographic. White rock audience was willing to consume rebellion, but it had to be safely packaged. It had to be palatable. It had to be less threatening. Without the band's presence or consent, Blackwell began the systematic corporate whitewashing of their music. He took the master tapes of Catch a Fire and began stripping away the raw, authentic edges. He brought in white American rock musicians, specifically the guitarist Wayne Perkins, and instructed them to overdub the reggae tracks with extended rock guitar solos. He added synthesizers and clavinet layers to soften the heavy bass and drum rhythms. He artificially sped up the tempo of the songs, believing the traditional, slow, hypnotic groove of reggae would bore Western listeners. When Peter Tosh heard the final manipulated version of the album, he was physically sickened. The corporate machine had taken the militant heartbeat of Trenchtown and gentrified it. The music he had built to be a weapon against Babylon had been deliberately softened and polished to serve as background music for the very people he was fighting against. But the sonic dilution was only the first phase of Blackwell's strategy. The second phase was a calculated act of institutional murder. Island Records realized that selling a collective trio of Rastafarian militants was structurally inefficient. Marketing requires a focal point, a single, easily digestible icon. Blackwell looked at the three men and made a ruthless demographic decision. Peter Tosh was too tall, his skin was too dark, his voice was too aggressive, and his political ideology was far too hostile. Bunny Wailer was too mystic and unpredictable, but Bob Marley possessed a lighter complexion owing to his white father. His facial features were softer. His vocal delivery, while passionate, leaned toward a unifying melodic plea rather than a militant demand. Marley could be marketed as a peaceful, benign mystic, a safe, exotic prophet of love and weed who would not threaten the racia, no comfort of the white Western audience. Blackwell entirely restructured the band's identity. He erased the egalitarian brotherhood of the Wailing Wailers. When the subsequent albums were released, the marketing materials, the album covers, and the press releases featured a new, deliberately manufactured brand, Bob Marley and the Wailers. This simple semantic shift was an act of profound, agonizing violence against Peter Tosh. He was the man who had taught Bob Marley how to play the guitar. He had built the structural foundations of their sound. He had starved in the same yards, suffered the same poverty, and fought the same early producers. And now, with the stroke of a corporate pen, his identity was erased. He was shoved into the shadows, officially downgraded in the global public consciousness to a nameless, faceless backup musician standing behind his own student. The marketing campaign was ruthlessly efficient. Island Records plastered Bob Marley's face across billboards in London and New York. Journalists were instructed to direct their questions exclusively to Marley. When the band went on tour to support the albums, the dynamic on stage had been artificially permanently altered. Marley was positioned directly in the center, bathed in the primary stage lighting, while Tosh and Bunny were physically pushed to the sides, literally marginalized in the shadows. For Tosh, the resentment was consuming. It was not born of petty jealousy. It was born of a deep, visceral sense of systemic theft. He was forced to watch a wealthy, white-owned corporation extract the intricate musical foundations he had spent his life building, use them to enrich his partner, and actively hide his own name from the global public. He famously and bitterly began referring to Chris Blackwell as Chris Whitewell and openly called the label Island of Shit Records. He recognized that the colonial exploitation he had fought in the streets of Jamaica had simply put on a tailored suit and Ovid into a London boardroom. The ultimate tragedy of this corporate strategy, however, was not just the theft of Tosh's public identity. It was the total destruction of his brotherhood. Bob Marley, eager to escape the poverty of Trenchtown and spread his message globally, accepted the crown that Chris Blackwell handed him. He did not fight the name change. He went along with the corporate strategy. For Peter Tosh, this was the absolute unforgivable betrayal. The sacred bond forged in the slums of Kingston was shattered. Tosh felt that Marley had sold out the collective integrity of the group for individual glory engineered by a white executive. The tension within the band became toxic. The grueling, freezing tours across the UK and the US in 1973 became a pressure cooker of unexpressed rage. Rehearsals frequently devolved into bitter physical confrontations. Bunny Wailer was the first to break. Exhausted by the grueling tour schedules and disgusted by the corporate manipulation, he quit the band, refusing to leave Jamaica. Tosh stayed a few months longer, his jaw clenched, fulfilling his contractual obligations, while the resentment boiled in his veins. But his militant dignity would not allow him to exist as a subjugated prop in another man's corporate narrative. In late 1974, Peter Tosh made the final, definitive decision. He walked away from the biggest, most lucrative reggae band in the world. He severed all professional ties with Bob Marley and Island Records. He refused to compromise his identity for a paycheck, and he refused to be the silent shadow in the background of the music he had engineered. He stepped out into the world as a solo artist. He was finally free from the corporate muzzle, but he was entirely alone, carrying an immense heavy burden of bitterness and a burning desire for retribution against the system that had robbed him. He was preparing to release his own music, raw and unfiltered, specifically designed to attack the geopolitical structures of Babylon. But Tosh did not realize that by declaring open, uncompromised war on the political establishment, he was placing a massive lethal target directly on his own back. The corporate executives in London had only tried to erase his legacy. The Jamaican government and the state police forces were about to try and erase his life. Walking away from the international tours, the corporate marketing budgets, and the safety of the group dynamic in late 1974 was an act of profound professional suicide. But for Tosh, it was an absolute moral necessity. He was entirely independent, stripped of the financial scaffolding that supported his former bandmates. Yet, he was not defeated. The resentment that boiled within him did not paralyze his creativity. It crystallized it. He was a man who had finally taken the muzzle off, and he prepared to use his newfound solo platform to launch a direct, unapologetic assault on the systemic corruption of Jamaican society. To understand the absolute danger of what Peter Tosh was about to do, one must understand the political reality of Jamaica in the mid to late 1970s. The island was effectively engaged in a low-level civil war. The political landscape was brutally divided between two rival factions: the Democratic Socialist People's National Party, PNP, led by Michael Manley, and the conservative U.S.-backed Jamaica Labor Party, JLP, led by Edward Seaga. This was not a polite political disagreement. Both parties armed heavily militarized gangs in the Kingston ghettos to enforce their borders and intimidate voters. The streets were flooded with illegal firearms, and the death toll was staggering. The police force and the military were frequently deployed as blunt instruments of state terror, operating with absolute impunity in the impoverished neighborhoods. In this hyper-violent, deeply polarized environment, popular musicians were expected to align themselves with a political tribe for protection and patronage. Peter Tosh, K., categorically refused. He viewed both political parties as two different heads of the exact same colonial monster. He despised the shit stem, his term for the institutional framework that kept the black underclass impoverished, uneducated, and terrorized by the police. In 1976, he released his debut solo album, Legalize It. To a modern Western audience, the title track is often misconstrued as a laid-back, recreational anthem for marijuana consumption. In the context of 1970s Jamaica, however, it was a highly aggressive, direct political challenge to the state. The Jamaican government utilized the draconian anti-ganja laws specifically to criminalize and control the Rastafarian population. The police used the smell of marijuana as a legal pretext to raid Rastafarian communes, physically beat the inhabitants, forcefully cut off their sacred dreadlocks, and throw them into horrific, overcrowded prisons. By demanding the legalization of marijuana, Tosh was not asking for the right to get high. He was demanding that the state disarm one of its primary legal weapons against the black underclass. He was demanding religious freedom and economic sovereignty. The Jamaican government immediately banned the song from the national radio networks. Tosh, anticipating this exact reaction, recognized that a ban was the ultimate validation of his message. The censorship only fueled the underground popularity of the record, establishing him not as a pop star, but as a genuine, uncompromising revolutionary figure operating outside the control of the state. The following year, he released his masterpiece, Equal Rights. The album drew a distinct, undeniable line in the sand between his ideology and the increasingly pacifist, universally palatable message being marketed by Bob Marley's corporate handlers. While Marley was singing One Love, Tosh looked at the systemic violence of Kingston and delivered a devastating counter-argument. On the title track, he sang, "Everyone is crying out for peace? Yes. None is crying out for justice. I don't want no peace. I need equal rights and justice." Tosh understood a fundamental historical truth. Peace without justice is simply a demand for the oppressed to suffer quietly so that the privileged are not inconvenienced by their screams. He rejected the concept of turning the other cheek. He adopted the persona of a militant warrior, frequently performing on stage in military fatigues, wielding a guitar shaped like an M16 assault rifle. He was signaling to the political establishment that he was completely unafraid, and that he would not allow his music to be used as a pacifier for the masses. This ideological collision between the musician and the state culminated in one of the most tense, explosive moments in Jamaican cultural history, the One Love Peace concert in April 1978. The concert was organized by leaders of the rival political gangs in a desperate attempt to halt the spiraling violence in Kingston. It was designed to be a massive, unifying public relations event. Bob Marley, who had survived an assassination attempt in his own home 2 years prior, was flown back to Jamaica to headline the show. The entire political establishment, including Prime Minister Michael Manley and opposition leader Edward Seaga, sat in the front rows of the National Stadium, flanked by heavy security military snipers and high-ranking police commissioners. The climax of the concert is globally remembered for Bob Marley calling Manley and Seaga onto the stage and holding their hands together above his head. It was a beautiful, highly marketable image of unity that the international press eagerly consumed. But earlier that same evening, Peter Tosh had taken the stage, and his performance was the exact terrifying opposite of a peaceful reconciliation. Tosh looked out at the 30,000 people in the stadium, and then he looked directly down at the front rows where the politicians and the police commanders were sitting comfortably in their VIP seats. He did not smile. He did not offer a message of forgiveness. Instead, he pulled out a massive marijuana spliff, lit it in front of the authorities, who had locked up thousands of his brothers for doing the exact same thing, and began to lecture the rulers of Jamaica. For nearly 45 minutes, Tosh halted the music and delivered a blistering, unscripted sermon. He explicitly condemned the hypocrisy of the politicians sitting in front of him, accusing them of dividing the people with guns while pretending to seek peace. He directly addressed the police commissioners, condemning their officers for the daily brutality inflicted upon the poor. He stripped away the polite diplomatic facade of the concert and forced the men responsible for the violence to sit and listen to the raw, unfiltered fury of the ghetto. It was an act of breathtaking bravery, but it was also an act of total, fatalistic recklessness. You do not publicly humiliate the architects of state violence in a developing nation and expect to simply walk away. Tosh had drawn a massive, highly visible target on his own back. The politicians smiled tightly for the cameras that night, but the police force did not forget the insult. They simply waited for the international journalists to leave the island, and then they prepared to extract their revenge. 5 months later, in September 1978, the state executed its retaliation. The details of the attack are a chilling testament to the brutal reality of state-sanctioned violence. Peter Tosh was not arrested during a political riot or an armed standoff. He was simply standing outside a recording studio in Kingston, socializing with a few friends. A squad of plainclothes police officers, heavily armed and operating without uniforms to maintain deniability, arrived at the scene. They claimed they smelled marijuana. They did not read him his rights or attempt to place him in handcuffs. The officers grabbed Tosh, a man whose towering haitré usually deterred physical confrontation, and forcefully dragged him away from the public street and out of the sight of potential witnesses. They hauled him into the confined, windowless space of the Halfway Tree police station. Once the doors were locked, the officers initiated a sadistic, highly coordinated assault. This was not a standard police beating designed to subdue a suspect. It was a targeted, calculated assassination attempt. Up to 10 officers participated in the torture. They used heavy wooden batons, their boots, and their fists. They specifically targeted his hands, attempting to shatter the bones to ensure he could never play the guitar again. When Tosh tried to use his arms to protect his face, the officers focused their assault on his torso and his head. They beat him with a ferocity that defied human logic. They struck him so hard and so repeatedly that they literally cracked his skull open, exposing the bone. They shattered several of his ribs and inflicted massive internal hemorrhaging. Tosh, bleeding profusely and struggling to remain conscious under the relentless barrage of blows, realized that the officers had absolutely no intention of arresting him. They intended to beat him to death inside the station, and they would later claim he had resisted arrest or attempted to assault them. It was a standard, lethal tactic utilized by corrupt police forces worldwide. Understanding that his life was ending, Tosh relied on a desperate survival instinct. He forced his body to go completely limp. He stopped moving, stopped making noise, and feigned death. The police officers, looking down at his mutilated, bleeding body on the concrete floor, assumed they had successfully completed their objective. Satisfied that the militant voice of the wailers had finally been silenced, they stopped the beating. Tosh barely survived the encounter. He was eventually transported to a hospital where surgeons had to stitch his scalp back together and treat his shattered bones. The physical scars of the attack were horrific. For the rest of his life, he carried the deep, jagged indentations on his skull, a permanent physical receipt of the price the state demands from those who refuse to stay silent. But while the doctors were able to repair his broken ribs and stitch his flesh, they could not repair the catastrophic damage inflicted upon his psychological infrastructure. The beating inside the Halfway Tree police station fundamentally, permanently altered the architecture of Peter Tosh's mind. He had survived the ruthless corporate theft of his identity by Island Records, and he had now survived a literal state-sanctioned execution attempt by the Jamaican police. The boundaries of his world had violently collapsed. He realized with absolute clarity that there was no safe harbor left. The music industry wanted to erase his legacy to protect their profits, and the government wanted to destroy his body to protect their power. This was the exact moment the militant warrior began to transform into a hunted animal. The fierce, righteous anger that had defined his music began to curdle into a dark, impenetrable state of severe paranoia. He retreated into the fortress of his own mind, trusting absolutely no one and preparing for the next attack. The physical beating had ended, but the true suffocating prison of his existence was only just being constructed. The physical recovery from the brutal, unprovoked beating inside the Halfway Tree police station took months, but the psychological reconstruction of Peter Tosh was a process that would never truly be completed. When a man is beaten so severely by the agents of the state that his skull is fractured and his internal organs are ruptured, the concept of safety is permanently eradicated from his consciousness. He emerged from the hospital in late 1978 with a deeply scarred head and a fundamentally altered worldview. The police had failed to execute him, but they had successfully murdered the last remaining fragments of his trust in the world. Despite this profound internal terror, Peter Tosh refused to stop working. In fact, his near-death experience seemed to inject a desperate, high-stakes urgency into his career. If the system was going to kill him, he was going to ensure his message was broadcast as loudly and as widely as possible before they succeeded. Salvation, ironically, arrived not from the reggae establishment, but from the highest echelon of the white Western rock elite. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones had been observing the reggae scene closely. Unlike Chris Blackwell, who viewed Tosh's militant aggression as a marketing liability, the Stones viewed it as authentic, dangerous rock and roll credibility. They did not want a sanitized, peaceful prophet. They wanted the stepping razor. In 1978, they signed Peter Tosh to their own newly formed imprint, Rolling Stones Records. It was a massive, highly publicized alliance. The Stones possessed the financial capital and the global distribution network to bypass the traditional reggae gatekeepers entirely. They featured Tosh as the opening act on their massive U.S. stadium tour, placing the uncompromising Jamaican militant directly in front of tens of thousands of American rock fans every night. Jagger even recorded a duet with Tosh, a cover of The Temptations' Walk and Don't Look Back, which became an international hit and resulted in Tosh performing on the legendary American television program Saturday Night Live. For a brief period, it appeared that Peter Tosh had finally outmaneuvered the system. He was making significant money, he was commanding international stages, and he was no longer operating in the shadow of Bob Marley. He released a string of critically acclaimed, fiercely political albums, including Bush Doctor, Mystic Man, and Wanted, Dread, and Alive. He was financially independent and globally recognized. But the glamorous reality of international rock tours is a temporary illusion. The stadium lights eventually turn off, the private jets land, and a man must return home. When Tosh returned to Jamaica between tours in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the jarring contrast between his international status and his domestic reality was staggering. In New York and London, he was a revered musical icon, rubbing shoulders with the biggest rock stars on the planet. In Kingston, he was still a prime target for the police, heavily surveilled by the state, and constantly vulnerable to the intense, spiraling political violence that was tearing the island apart. This duality accelerated his paranoia. He could not reconcile the two worlds. He began to view the international music industry with the exact same deep suspicion he reserved for the Jamaican police. He believed, not without historical justification, that corporate executives were constantly plotting to steal his publishing rights, manipulate his contracts, and sabotage his career to ensure that Bob Marley remained the undisputed king of the genre. He scrutinized every contract, frequently fired managers, and alienated potential allies with his aggressive defensive posture. In May 1981, the dynamic of his world shifted again permanently. Bob Marley, his childhood friend, his former bandmate, and his greatest rival, died of melanoma at the age of 36. The death of Bob Marley was a profound, complex trauma for Peter Tosh. The brotherhood forged in the dirt yards of Trenchtown had been shattered by corporate greed, and they had spent the last 7 years of Marley's life engaged in a bitter, highly public feud. Yet despite the anger and the feeling of betrayal, the underlying bond of their shared history remained. When Marley died, Tosh lost the only other man on earth who truly understood the massive, crushing weight of their specific journey. However, the music industry's reaction to Marley's death only deepened Tosh's bitterness. Island Records and the Fee. A global media immediately launched a massive posthumous deification campaign. Marley was elevated from a pop star to a secular saint. His image was printed on millions of college dormitory posters. His complex political beliefs were smoothed over, and he was permanently cast in bronze as the flawless, universally beloved symbol of reggae. For Tosh, this was the ultimate inescapable insult. He was now fighting a ghost. He was the undisputed surviving architect of the music, possessing a stronger voice and a more authentic, uncompromising message than ever before. Yet the industry and the public were more interested in worshiping a sanitized memory than engaging with the difficult, challenging reality of the living man who had actually built the foundation. He felt that Babylon had finally won. They had successfully commercialized the revolution and buried the true revolutionary. Throughout the 1980s, Peter Tosh's paranoia solidified into a permanent psychological architecture. The fear was no longer a reaction to a specific threat. It was the baseline frequency of his daily existence. He was a wealthy man who had escaped the physical confines of the ghetto, purchasing a large, upscale home in the affluent Kingston suburb of Barbican. But wealth cannot buy psychological security when your mind is fundamentally broken by trauma. His home, which should have been a sanctuary, was transformed into a tense, heavily fortified compound. The man who sang about global liberation was a prisoner in his own living room. He trusted no one outside of a very small, tightly controlled inner circle. He viewed strangers with intense, open hostility. The unedited interviews from this era reveal a man who was brilliant, articulate, but deeply, profoundly exhausted by his own vigilance. The most chilling manifestation of his mental state was his nightly routine. Peter Tosh, the globally recognized advocate for human rights, the man who had faced down armed police officers and, in turn, national corporate executives, could not sleep without a lethal weapon within immediate reach. Every single night he placed a fully loaded handgun directly beneath his pillow. He slept with the constant, terrifying expectation that the door would be kicked in, and the agents of the state or the agents of the industry would finally come to finish the job they had started in the halfway tree police station. But Tosh fundamentally misidentified the direction from which the lethal blow would come. He was looking up, watching the politicians, the police commissioners, and the record executives. He was entirely blind to the threat growing directly beneath him. The brutal reality of achieving massive financial success while originating from extreme poverty is a phenomenon frequently referred to as the ghetto curse. When an individual escapes the desperate, crushing poverty of a place like Trenchtown, the community they leave behind does not simply wave goodbye and wish them well. The structural poverty of Kingston meant that there was no social safety net, no welfare state, and no economic opportunity for the underclass. Therefore, a successful artist is immediately reclassified by their old community. They cease to be a former neighbor. They become a highly lucrative, heavily targeted utility. They become a walking ATM. Tosh suffered from this curse more severely than most, precisely because he refused to abandon his principles. He vehemently rejected the elitism of the Jamaican upper class. Despite moving to the wealthy suburb of Barbican, he deliberately kept his gates open to the people of the ghetto. He felt a profound, agonizing sense of survivor's guilt and a militant obligation to redistribute his wealth to the people who were still suffering under the system he had escaped. He was a man of staggering, almost reckless generosity. Every day, a steady stream of people from the old neighborhoods would arrive at his gates in Barbican. They came asking for money to pay rent, money to buy food, money to fund medical operations, and money to pay school fees. Tosh continuously, quietly handed out enormous amounts of cash. He funded entire families. He provided a makeshift private welfare system for people the government had completely abandoned. But extreme generosity in an environment defined by extreme desperation does not breed gratitude. It breeds violent entitlement. The people receiving the money began to view it not as a gift, but as a mandatory tax that Tosh owed them simply because he had survived and they had not. The dynamic shifted from charity to extortion. If he refused a request, or if he simply did not have the cash on hand, the reaction was not understanding. It was immediate, bitter resentment. The community began to view his wealth as their own property. Tosh's fatal flaw was his belief that his militant aura, his imposing physical size, and his history of defiance would command respect and protect him from the very people he was trying to help. He believed that because he was fighting for the liberation of the black underclass, the underclass would recognize him as a brother and a protector. He was tragically, devastatingly wrong. Poverty does not inherently create nobility. Prolonged, desperate poverty creates ruthlessness. In the mid-1980s, Tosh's open-door policy brought a man named Dennis Laban into his immediate orbit. Laban, known in the streets by the nickname Lepo, was not a stranger. He was a childhood friend from the deep, violent trenches of the Kingston slums. Their history went back decades to the days before the international record deals and the global tours, when they were both just starving youths trying to survive the yards. Lepo's trajectory, however, had been vastly different from Tosh's. While Tosh had channeled his anger into music, Lepo had channeled his into crime. He was an ex-convict, a man who had spent significant time inside the brutal, unforgiving Jamaican penal system. When Lepo was finally released from prison, he emerged into a society that offered him absolutely no path to rehabilitation or employment. He was destitute, hardened by the prison system, and desperate. Peter Tosh, driven by his fierce loyalty to his roots and his deep compassion for the victims of the system, made a decision that would ultimately cost him his life. He looked at Lepo, an ex-convict with a violent history, and he did not see a threat. He saw a brother who had been crushed by the Babylon machine. Tosh took Lepo into his own home. He provided the man with a safe place to sleep, away from the violence of the streets. He fed him, clothed him, and gave him steady access to his resources. Tosh actively tried to rehabilitate his old friend, hoping that by providing a stable environment and financial support, he could pull Lepo out of the cycle of criminality. He extended the absolute vulnerable trust of brotherhood to a man whose moral compass had been completely obliterated by the reality of the streets. For a time, Lepo lived in the orbit of Tosh's wealth, enjoying the protection and the proximity to international fame. But the proximity to wealth, when combined with a deeply ingrained sense of ghetto entitlement, is a highly toxic combination. Lepo did not look at the house in Barbican and feel gratitude for his rescue. He looked at the house, the international royalties, and the constant stream of cash, and he felt a deep, festering, violent resentment. He did not want to be a charity case living in the shadow of a famous man. He wanted the money for himself. By the late summer of 1987, Tosh was experiencing a rare moment of domestic tranquility and professional optimism. He had just returned to Jamaica, and his latest album, No Nuclear War, had been released to widespread critical acclaim, signaling a massive international comeback. The evening of Friday, September 11th, found the 42-year-old sitting in the living room of his heavily fortified home in the affluent Barbican neighborhood. He was spending a quiet night with his common-law wife, Andrea Marlene Brown, and trusted friends like radio broadcaster Jeffrey D.I. Dixon. Tosh had spent his entire adult life looking over his shoulder, waiting for corporate assassins or the police to come through the front door. He believed he was finally safe behind his iron gates, never expecting that the executioner would be a man to whom he had already given the keys. But physical gates are entirely useless when the threat is a man who already knows how to navigate them. Dennis Lepo Laban did not have to scale the perimeter wall or break a window to gain entry. He possessed the most dangerous weapon a criminal can wield against a secure target: familiarity. Lepo had lived in that house. He had eaten at that table. He knew the layout of the rooms, the blind spots of the property, and the routines of the household. More importantly, he knew that Peter Tosh, despite his intense paranoia regarding the government and the music industry, harbored a fatal blind spot for the men who shared his Trenchtown roots. When a knock came at the door that evening, it was not an anonymous threat. It was a familiar face. Lepo was recognized and granted entry, but he did not step into the living room as a friend seeking shelter or a warm meal. He stepped through the door as an executioner, and he had not come alone. Lepo was accompanied by 2 other men, both heavily armed and entirely committed to the violent task at hand. The sudden, jarring shift in the atmosphere of the living room was absolute. The quiet evening of television and conversation was instantly obliterated by the terrifying, metallic sound of handguns being drawn and leveled at the occupants. The motive was not political assassination. It was not a conspiracy orchestrated by rival record executives in London, nor was it a hit ordered by corrupt police commissioners in Kingston. The motive was crude and unadulterated and devastatingly petty. Lepo wanted cash. He stood in the center of the living room, pointing a gun at the man who had pulled him out of the gutter, and demanded that Tosh hand over American dollars. The psychological mechanics of this specific extortion are crucial to understand. Lepo was operating under the deeply ingrained, ignorant assumptions of the ghetto curse. He looked at the large house, the satellite dish, and the international fame, and his mind, hardened by the desperation of the streets and the brutal logic of the prison system, assumed that Tosh must have massive duffel bags of physical currency hidden inside the residence. He believed the cartoonish myth of the endlessly wealthy rock star. Tosh, remaining remarkably calm under the barrel of a gun, attempted to inject reality into a completely irrational situation. He looked at his former friend and explained the basic mechanics of international wealth. He stated that he had just returned from an overseas trip. He explained that a man of his stature does not keep thousands of dollars in physical cash lying around a living room. His money was tied up in international bank accounts, in publishing royalties, and in global investments. He genuinely did not have the cash Lepo was demanding, but a desperate, armed man operating on entitlement and resentment is utterly incapable of processing logic. Lepo refused to believe him. He interpreted Tosh's explanation not as the truth, but as an insult. He felt that the wealthy global icon was simply holding out on him, refusing to share the wealth with a brother from the slums. The resentment that had festered inside Lepo during the months he had lived under Tosh's charity suddenly boiled over into extreme sadistic violence. Lepo and his accomplices violently escalated the situation. They began to systematically terrorize the room. They forced Peter Tosh, a man whose entire public identity was built on unyielding militant dignity, to lie see down on his own living room floor. They forced Marlene Brown, Free Eye, Joy Dixon, and the other guests to the ground alongside him. When Doc Brown arrived at the house moments later, completely unaware of the hostage situation, he walked directly into the ambush and was immediately forced onto the floor with the rest of them. For several agonizing hours, the gunmen held the household hostage. This was not a swift professional robbery. It was a prolonged, humiliating exercise in psychological and physical torture. Lepo paced the room, shouting demands, threatening to kill everyone if the money was not produced. To force a confession, the gunsmen began to physically beat the hostages. They struck Tosh with the butts of their handguns, demanding he open a safe that did not exist. Imagine the profound, crushing psychological horror of those hours for Peter Tosh. As he lay bleeding on his own floor, surrounded by his terrified friends, the full, devastating irony of his life's work must have crashed down upon him. He had spent his entire adult life fighting for the liberation of the black underclass. He had sacrificed his international marketability, his physical safety, and his mental health to wage a global war against the systemic oppression of Babylon. He had suffered the brutal batons of the Jamaican police specifically because he refused to stop defending the people of the ghetto. And now the very people he had fought to defend, the very underclass he had sacrificed his body to protect, were standing over him with loaded weapons, beating him over a perceived stack of cash. The enemy was not wearing a police uniform or a corporate suit. The enemy was a man he had fed. The betrayal was total, absolute, and unforgivable. Yet even in the face of certain death, Peter Tosh's militant core did not fracture. According to the survivor accounts of that horrific night, Tosh refused to cower. He did not beg for his life. He remained defiant, continuously telling Lepo, Tiab there was no money, and refusing to surrender his dignity to a common extortionist. He was the stepping razor until the very last second. Eventually, the grim reality of the situation settled upon Lepo. He had tortured the inhabitants of the house for hours, and the money had not materialized. He realized that Tosh was telling the truth. The physical cash simply was not there. But Lepo had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. He had invaded the home of one of the most famous men in Jamaica, held him hostage, and beaten his family. If he simply walked out the door, Tosh would survive, and the retaliation from Tosh's fiercely loyal supporters in the streets would be swift and fatal. Lepo had backed himself into a corner of his own making. He made the cold-blooded, terrifying calculation that the only way to escape the consequences of his actions was to leave no witnesses. Lepo did not hesitate. He walked over to the man who had given him shelter, the man who had written the global anthems of peace and equal rights, and he raised his weapon. He looked Peter Tosh directly in the eyes. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the affluent suburb, a sharp, violent punctuation mark ending one of the most brilliant musical minds of the 20th century. Tosh was shot twice in the head. The man who had survived the ruthless machinery of the global recording industry and who had survived his skull being cracked open by state police was instantly executed on his own carpet. But the slaughter did not end with him. Lepo and his accomplices, acting with ruthless, panicked efficiency, turned their weapons on the other hostages lying on the floor. They opened fire on the captive group. Jeff Free I. Dixon, the beloved radio broadcaster, was shot and killed. Doc Brown, the traditional healer, was shot and killed. Marlene Brown and several other guests sustained severe gunshot wounds, but miraculously survived the barrage. The gunmen then fled into a Kingston night, leaving behind a scene of absolute senseless carnage. They had destroyed a musical pioneer, murdered 2 innocent men, and shattered a family, and they walked out of the Barbican house with absolutely nothing. There was no money. The entire massacre had been perpetrated over an illusion. The immediate aftermath of the massacre left a void that the establishment eagerly ignored. While Bob Marley had received a massive state-sponsored funeral, Peter Tosh's murder was cynically dismissed by the global press as just another predictable casualty of Jamaican street violence. Dennis Lepo Loban was positively identified by the surviving hostages, convicted, and locked away for life, but his capture offered no actual justice. The international music industry quietly used the brutal circumstances of Tosh's death to validate their initial decision to marginalize him. They framed him as a dangerous militant who inevitably met a violent end, deliberately ignoring the devastating, unvarnished irony of his murder. Peter Tosh was not killed because he lived a criminal life. He was executed because he refused to build an impenetrable wall between his hard-earned wealth and the desperate poverty of his roots. He was the foundational architect of reggae, who successfully survived the ruthless, multi-million-dollar extraction of a white-owned corporate machine. He physically survived the skull-cracking brutality of a militarized police state. Yet, the final, fatal blow did not come from the Babylon system he fought his entire life. The stepping razor was violently erased by the exact same blind, desperate greed he had sacrificed his life to cure, murdered over an illusion of cash right inside his own sanctuary.